They laughed so hard I thought one of them might choke. The kind of laughter that's not just amusement, but something cruel wrapped in layers of delight. The kind that cuts deep because it's directed at you. It was my 80th birthday party, or what was supposed to be a celebration of my life, a milestone reached with dignity and grace. But instead it turned into a night I will never forget for all the wrong reasons. The room was bright with warm yellow lights, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the aroma of candles burning softly on the wooden table, set with delicate china, and the best linens I still had tucked away for occasions like this. I had spent days preparing the guest list, baking my famous lemon cake, and selecting just the right words for my toast. Something heartfelt. Something that spoke of family and the passage of time, of love that stretches over decades. I wanted this to be a moment of connection, a moment where the stories of years would mingle with laughter and gentle smiles. But instead, it became a memory soaked in humiliation and quiet betrayal. They spiked my drink with laxatives. It was not a whisper or a subtle slip. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, a joke that echoed through the evening like a bitter note no one wanted to acknowledge. I felt it almost immediately, the sudden urgent need to flee from the table, the burning in my stomach that twisted and turned like a storm inside me. I excused myself quickly, my voice barely audible over the laughter that followed, and made my way to the bathroom. The door shut behind me with a dull click, and I was alone with the harsh fluorescent lights and the cold, unforgiving tile beneath my feet. The night became a long, endless vigil spent on the cold porcelain throne, the laughter and muffled voices filtering through the thin walls, a reminder of the people who had just moments before been smiling at me, pretending to celebrate me, but now were only amused by my discomfort and pain. This was not just an accident or a careless mistake. It was a carefully crafted moment of exclusion, a way to remind me that at 80 years old, I was no longer a beloved matriarch, but an inconvenient relic, someone to be mocked rather than cherished. As I sat there, feeling the sharp sting of betrayal, I thought about how this wasn't the first time I had been made to feel invisible in my own family, how the birthday cards stopped coming years ago, how the phone calls dwindled until they were rare and filled with hesitation, how my presence at family gatherings was tolerated, but never truly welcomed. The laughter outside the door was a confirmation of what I had feared all along, that I had become a joke, a burden, a secret best kept behind closed doors and forced smiles. And yet, I am still here. I am still standing, even if it feels like I am balancing on the edge of a precipice. I live alone now, in a small apartment where the windows overlook a quiet street, the kind of place where the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting are distant and faint. I tend to my garden, a modest collection of pots and blooms that remind me there is still beauty to be found, even in the smallest of places. I read books that take me far away from the loneliness, stories of resilience and redemption, hoping to find in them a reflection of the strength I must summon to face each new day. I am an 80-year-old woman who has been quietly humiliated by those who should have loved me most, and yet I have learned that the weight of their cruelty does not have to define me. This story I tell now is not just about the night they spiked my drink, but about the long journey from invisibility to recognition, from silent suffering to quiet rebellion. It is about the moment when the laughter stopped controlling me, and I found a way to respond, not with anger or vengeance, but with the sharpest, most unexpected weapon I could wield, my own voice, my own agency, and yes, a little hot sauce in their toothpaste. Because if they thought I was going to disappear quietly, to wither away into the shadows of their amusement, they were wrong. I am here. I am still here. And I am not done yet. The moment they slipped the laxatives into my drink was not accompanied by any grand announcement or dramatic gesture. It was a quiet, almost casual act, cloaked in the guise of jest and lightheartedness, but beneath it lay a sting sharper than any spoken insult. I remember holding that glass, the cool surface of the crystal, trembling slightly in my hand, feeling the warmth of the room and the eyes of my family around me. I had just finished my toast, a speech filled with soft nostalgia and a hope to bridge the widening gaps between us, when one of my grandchildren nudged another and whispered something just loud enough for the youngest adults at the table to catch. Then the giggles began, low at first, then swelling like a tide of mockery that no one attempted to stem. I thought maybe I had misheard, that perhaps it was a coincidence, but the sinking feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. The taste in my mouth shifted suddenly, the edges of the sweet punch turning sour and strange. I tried to smile, to keep the moment light as I took another sip, but the warmth was fleeting and replaced by an uneasy churning deep inside me. It was the kind of sickness that comes not from the body alone, but from the sharp betrayal of those who should have been kindest. The family dinner, which had been filled with polite conversation and forced smiles, dissolved into an undercurrent of cruel amusement. I excused myself quickly, saying I needed some fresh air, but the truth was I was desperate to escape the creeping panic that was twisting my insides with growing urgency. The hallway outside the dining room felt impossibly long and cold, the carpet muffling my footsteps as I hurried to the bathroom, trying to keep my face composed even as the first waves of discomfort began to crash over me. Behind the locked door, the stark white tiles and harsh lighting did nothing to soothe the embarrassment that was settling like a heavy weight on my chest. I was alone, yet painfully exposed. The muffled laughter from the other room felt like it was bouncing off the walls, mocking me from every corner. This was not a moment of careless youth playing a harmless prank. It was an act that marked me as less than human, less than worthy of respect or dignity. They were saying without words that I was nothing more than a source of entertainment, an object to be laughed at rather than listened to. I had spent years nurturing this family, offering my time and my love with quiet consistency, often invisibly, while they grew and flourished around me. I had baked cakes, mended clothes, attended every recital and game, and yet here I was, discarded and degraded in the very home I had helped build. The sharp irony was not lost on me. The party, with its decorations and carefully arranged seating, was supposed to be a testament to my life, a marker of the years I had lived and the wisdom I had gathered. Instead, it became a stage for my humiliation, a memory they would carry with them as a joke at my expense. And yet, in that moment of pain and shock, something inside me shifted. It was not rage, at least not yet, but a profound clarity. I saw clearly how little they valued me, how easily I could be erased from their lives with a cheap trick and a few cruel laughs. The realization was bitter, but it also opened a door to something new, a recognition that if I was going to be treated as a joke, then perhaps I needed to find a way to rewrite the script. The next hours blurred into a haze of discomfort and quiet retreat. The family continued their celebration, their laughter occasionally spilling into the hallway as I remained in the bathroom, trying to compose myself. I thought about how this had become my place, a prisoner in a room too small for my years, locked away like some forgotten relic. When I finally emerged, I avoided the eyes of those who had orchestrated my fall, choosing instead to slip quietly out into the night, the cool air against my skin a balm to the burning humiliation inside. As I walked away from the house that was no longer mine, I felt the weight of years pressing down, the memories of past kindnesses overshadowed by this single act of cruelty. It was a betrayal not just of a night, but of decades of shared history, a breaking of trust that could never be mended with apologies or empty gestures. This was the moment my journey began, not with a sudden outburst or a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet resolve of a woman who had been pushed too far and found, in the depths of her pain, the strength to stand back up and reclaim her story. I would not be a punchline. I would not disappear into the shadows they had cast around me. This night, this betrayal, became the catalyst for everything that followed. It was the first step on a path away from invisibility and towards a voice that could not be ignored. Though the room had been filled with laughter, I knew that it was my silence that would speak loudest in the days to come. And so, I began to plan, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet determination to remind them all, especially myself, that even at 80 years old, I was still here, still whole, and still capable of surprising them in ways they never expected. After that night, nothing was ever quite the same, though on the surface, the days slipped by with a deceptive normality, as if the cruel joke had been just a momentary lapse, something everyone could pretend never happened. But I knew better. The subtle shifts began almost imperceptibly, like the slow drip of water wearing away stone, a gradual erosion of my place in their lives. The family gatherings that used to be filled with warmth and laughter became affairs I was invited to out of obligation rather than affection. My presence was tolerated, not celebrated, and I could feel the invisible barrier that had been erected between me and the others. The jokes about my age grew sharper, less veiled in kindness, more blunt and dismissive. At first, I tried to laugh along, to smooth over the awkwardness with a smile or a quick comment, but inside, the hurt settled deeper, a quiet ache that no amount of politeness could mask. The group chats buzzed with messages about outings and events, but my name was conspicuously absent. I learned about plans only through passing mentions or the occasional glance that quickly darted away when I looked up. When I asked, the answers were vague. Just a small thing, or maybe next time. But the truth was clear to me. I was being excluded. The invitations stopped arriving altogether, replaced by polite texts that never mentioned meeting in person, just "hope you're well," or "thinking of you." I tried not to let it sting, but the isolation seeped into the corners of my days. At family dinners, the conversations flowed around me, never directed at me. My attempts to join in were met with half-listens or distracted glances. The grandchildren, who once sought my stories and advice, now seemed more interested in their phones and friends. I was fading into the background of my own family's narrative, becoming a ghost wandering through rooms where my voice no longer held weight. The daughter-in-law's smiles were tight and measured, her kindness edged with a sharpness I hadn't seen before. When I voiced a concern or shared a memory, she would pat my hand in that way people do when speaking to a child, or worse, a problem they want to dismiss. The son, my own flesh and blood, seemed caught between guilt and impatience. He would nod politely when I spoke, but quickly change the subject, as if uncomfortable with the person I had become, or perhaps the truths I was beginning to see. The tension was a constant hum beneath the surface, a reminder that I was no longer the beloved matriarch, but a source of inconvenience and embarrassment. The home I had once known as a place of comfort became a stage where I played a part I no longer recognized. The silent elder, the shadow in the corner. My belongings were treated with less care. The chair I always sat in was sometimes rearranged or pushed aside, as if to make room for someone more important. My opinions were asked for less often, then ignored altogether. Even the little rituals that had once connected us, Sunday lunches, holiday traditions, birthday celebrations, began to dissolve into hurried, impersonal gatherings, where I was merely a guest, not family. I felt the sting of invisibility most keenly during those moments. It was as if I were no longer part of their story, merely a footnote or an afterthought. I found myself withdrawing, not out of choice but necessity. To show my hurt was to invite dismissal, and I was tired of explaining feelings to those who preferred to look away. I stopped calling as often, stopped asking to come by. The silence was both a shield and a prison. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the distance grew not just between us, but inside me. I questioned myself, wondering if I had changed, if I had done something to deserve this slow exile. The mirrors offered no answers, only the reflection of a woman growing smaller in a world that seemed to want her diminished. Yet beneath the weight of loneliness, a quiet ember of defiance remained. I began to notice small details that once went unseen. The way the children's laughter sounded less joyful when I entered the room. The way conversations halted abruptly. The way my son's smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at me. These were not accidents, but deliberate acts of erasure. It was as if they were telling me without words that I no longer belonged in the tapestry of their lives. The evenings became the hardest. Sitting alone in my apartment, the silence pressed in around me like a physical force. I found myself clutching the phone, hesitating to reach out, knowing the answer would likely be the same. Polite avoidance, excuses, empty words. The nights were long, filled with memories of better times and the sharp pain of what had been lost. But in the solitude, something else stirred. A growing awareness that I could no longer rely on the people who had once promised to love and protect me. That realization was both heartbreaking and freeing. It meant I had to find a new way to exist, a new way to define myself beyond their dismissive gaze. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of myself I had set aside for the sake of family harmony. The books I wanted to read, the walks I wanted to take, the quiet moments I had denied myself. I started to journal, writing down the thoughts and feelings I had bottled up for years. The pages became a mirror reflecting not just the pain but the strength I had always carried beneath the surface. I realized that while they could exclude me, they could not erase the woman I was or the life I had lived. The slow erosion of my place in their lives was a challenge, but it was not the end. It was a beginning, the first step on a path toward reclaiming my dignity and my voice. In that quiet struggle, I found a new kind of resilience, one that did not rely on their approval or recognition. I learned to walk with my head held a little higher, even when the world seemed determined to make me small. The days of laughter at my expense had passed, but the laughter I carried within myself, the laughter of survival, of knowing my own worth, was just beginning. And so, the first escalation was not marked by dramatic confrontation or angry words, but by the slow, steady unraveling of my place in their lives and the quiet birth of a woman determined to find her own way out of the shadows. There came a day when the silence around me was no longer just an absence of sound, but a space filled with the weight of what had been lost and the possibilities of what might still be found. It was not a sudden epiphany, but a quiet unfolding inside me, a gentle stirring of the soul that began with small, almost imperceptible actions. After months of feeling invisible and unheard, I realized that waiting for them to see me again, to recognize me as the woman I had always been, was a path destined to lead nowhere. The moment I stopped hoping for their acknowledgement, I started noticing the world outside the narrow walls of my exclusion. I found myself walking longer routes during my daily errands, noticing the way sunlight spilled through the leaves of trees, how the air smelled just before rain, and how the rhythm of my own steps could steady my racing thoughts. These walks became my sanctuary, a place where I was not a forgotten grandmother or an overlooked guest, but simply a woman moving through space and time with purpose. At first, these changes were small and tentative. I bought a new journal, a modest notebook with a soft cover, and began writing down fragments of memory, feelings, and reflections that had no audience but my own quiet attention. The pages captured my loneliness, but also my growing strength, the emergence of a voice that was no longer muffled by shame or self-doubt. In those words, I began to reclaim the parts of myself that had been dulled by years of submission and invisibility. One afternoon, I found myself standing before the mirror longer than usual, tracing the lines on my face, the silver strands in my hair, and feeling, for the first time in a long while, a sense of acceptance rather than despair. I realized that I was not just the sum of their dismissals, but a woman who had lived, loved, and endured. The next step came quietly, almost by accident. On a trip to the grocery store, I lingered in the tea aisle, my fingers brushing against familiar boxes of chamomile and Earl Grey. I picked up a tin of my favorite blend, something I had not allowed myself to buy in years, because it was not part of the household anymore. As I held it in my hands, a simple, unexpected joy blossomed inside me. This tea was for me, not for anyone else, and that made all the difference. I bought it and carried it home like a small treasure, a symbol of a life I was beginning to reclaim. Back in my apartment, I brewed a cup and sat by the window, watching the world go by as the warm steam curled around my hands. In that moment, I understood that reclaiming my life would not be a grand, sweeping gesture, but a series of small, deliberate acts of care and self-respect. I began setting boundaries, gentle but firm lines, drawn around my time and energy. When invitations came, I chose which to accept, no longer feeling obligated to say yes to every request or demand. When conversations turned to painful topics or dismissive remarks, I learned to listen without absorbing the hurt, to hold my dignity intact even as the world around me shifted. Alongside these quiet shifts, I sought out new connections, reaching beyond the fractured family ties to build a circle of friends and acquaintances who valued me for who I was, not for the role I was expected to play. I joined a book club at the local library, where the discussion was lively and respectful, and I found myself eager to share my thoughts and listen to others. The women there ranged in age and background, but we shared a common desire for companionship and understanding. It was a balm to my spirit to be seen and heard in such a space, to know that I was not alone in my experiences or my hopes. At home, I started tending to my small garden with renewed purpose, planting bright flowers and herbs that brought life and color to the windowsill. The act of nurturing growth was a metaphor for my own journey, a reminder that even after seasons of neglect, there was still the potential for renewal and beauty. In the evenings, I allowed myself moments of quiet reflection, reading poetry, and listening to music that spoke to the depths of my heart. I began to dream again, not of the past or the family that had rejected me, but of a future shaped by my own choices and desires. This turning point was not without its challenges. Old wounds surfaced, memories of rejection and loneliness that still ached. But rather than burying these feelings, I faced them with honesty and compassion, allowing myself to grieve the loss of the life I once imagined, but no longer had. In that grief, I found the strength to let go of the pain that had held me captive for so long. I realized that reclaiming my life meant not only stepping away from the family that had cast me aside, but also forgiving myself for the years I had spent trying to hold on to their approval. I was no longer waiting for their permission to exist fully and authentically. This new awareness brought with it a profound sense of freedom, the freedom to choose my own path, to prioritize my own well-being, and to live without apology or shame. And so, the midpoint of my journey was not a moment of dramatic rebellion or confrontation, but a quiet awakening, a shift from victim to survivor, from silence to voice. It was the first step toward healing and agency, a turning point where I began to write the next chapter of my life on my own terms. I carried this shift with me as I moved forward, knowing that the road ahead would still hold obstacles and moments of doubt, but confident that I was no longer defined by the cruelty of others, but by the resilience and grace I found within myself. The days settled into a rhythm, quiet but purposeful, and for a time I thought I might be able to hold this fragile piece like a delicate flower between my fingers, guarding it from the storms that had so often battered my heart before. But the past, as it so often does, reached out with insistent hands, reminding me that the ties that bind are not easily severed, and that those who hold power often do not relinquish it without a fight. It began with a letter, the kind that arrives with a heavy weight, not just in the envelope, but in the words that spill out onto the page like a tide of unresolved history. The handwriting was familiar. My grandson's, the one who had always shown a quiet kindness in the midst of the family's chaos. His letter was filled with concern and longing. A bridge stretched across the distance that had grown between us. He asked where I was, how I was, if I was safe. His words were gentle, without accusation or blame, a flicker of light in the darkness I had inhabited for so long. Yet even as his letter warmed my heart, it was followed swiftly by other messages that carried a different tone altogether. Messages from my son and daughter-in-law, wrapped in the guise of care but heavy with expectation and thinly veiled demands. They spoke of worry, of the family's distress at my absence, and of the need to come home to resume the roles we had all played for so many years. Their words were polished, carefully constructed to sound reasonable, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. They wanted control, not reconciliation. The phone calls began soon after, a flurry of voices that left little room for my own to be heard. My son's voice was sharp, tinged with frustration and impatience, while my daughter-in-law's was cool, measured, the practiced tone of someone skilled in managing difficult conversations. They asked where I was staying, who I was with, what I was planning to do. Each question was a thread pulling at the fragile fabric of my newfound independence. I answered as best I could, carefully choosing my words to assert my boundaries without igniting the flames of conflict. But their persistence only grew, a relentless tide of calls and messages that left me feeling cornered and scrutinized. The family's concern was a mask for their need to reassert control, to pull me back into the roles they had assigned long ago. The obedient mother, the dutiful grandmother, the quiet fixture in their lives. I felt their eyes upon me even from afar, a presence that sought to shrink me once more into invisibility. Then came the visit from the lawyer, a man with sharp eyes and a clipped manner, who spoke on behalf of my son and daughter-in-law. He arrived at the cafe where I worked mornings, his presence a stark reminder that this was no longer just a family matter, but one entangled with legal and financial implications. He spoke of concerns for my well-being and the need to ensure that I was in a safe environment. His words were careful, almost clinical, but the message was clear. My independence was seen as a problem to be managed. I listened quietly, folding my apron and placing it on the counter with deliberate calm. I told him that I was of sound mind and in a safe place, that I was capable of making my own decisions. I told him there were no next steps unless I chose them, and that any further attempts to interfere would be considered harassment. His eyes flickered with something between surprise and irritation, but he said no more and left. The encounter was a test, a challenge to my autonomy, and I met it with the steady resolve that had been building within me. But the family's attempts to draw me back were not limited to official channels. The daughter-in-law showed up one afternoon at the cafe, her polished appearance and carefully controlled demeanor belying the nervous energy beneath. She spoke of panic and regret, of the mistake that had been made at my birthday party, and of the children's confusion and longing for their grandmother. She presented an envelope with money, a peace offering for the grandson struggling without my presence. I took the envelope, not because I wanted what was inside, but because I did not wish to give her the satisfaction of outright refusal. Yet I made it clear that the grandson did not need an intermediary. He knew how to reach me if he wished. Our conversation was tense, layered with unspoken truths and the distance that years of neglect had carved between us. She admitted with a weariness I had never seen before that she had not intended to replace me, only to carve out a space where the family could function without the shadow of the past looming in every room. Her words were the closest thing to honesty I had heard from her, and yet they were a reminder that the struggle for recognition and respect was far from over. The past kept returning in other forms too. A local newspaper article appeared, profiling my disappearance and the family's concern for my welfare. The quotes from my son and daughter-in-law painted me as vulnerable and lost, a woman who had vanished without warning and caused stress and confusion for those left behind. The article was a performance of sympathy, designed to garner public support for their narrative and to cast me once again as a figure of pity and helplessness. I laughed bitterly at their portrayal, recognizing the absurdity and cruelty of it all. I kept the clipping, not out of sentiment, but as proof of the lengths to which they would go to control the story and the image of me. The pressure mounted, but I stood firm, drawing strength from the new life I had built and the connections I was nurturing, the friends I had made, the routine I had established. The small victories of autonomy and self-care were shields against the encroaching storm. And then, one day, my grandson came to see me, arriving quietly and unannounced. His presence was a balm to my spirit, a reminder that even amidst the conflict and hurt, there were threads of love and hope that still held firm. We spoke not of the past or the family's demands, but of small things: books, birds, the rhythm of life in the city. His kindness was a refuge, a space where I could be seen and valued for who I was, not just for the roles I had played or the history I carried. This visit was a test for both of us, a moment of fragile reconnection that did not promise reconciliation, but offered a glimpse of possibility. The family's attempts to draw me back continued, but I met them with a quiet but unyielding resolve. I was no longer the woman who would bend to their will or endure their dismissals in silence. I was a woman who had reclaimed her voice and her agency, who understood that love and respect must be earned and cannot be demanded or coerced. The second escalation was not just a return of the past, but a reckoning, a confrontation that tested the boundaries I had set and the strength I had cultivated. It was a reminder that the path to freedom is never easy or straightforward, but that the courage to stand firm in the face of pressure is the foundation of true independence. And so, I continued forward, carrying with me the knowledge that I was no longer defined by their judgments or their attempts to control me. I was the author of my own story, and this chapter, filled with confrontation, struggle, and resilience, was mine to write. The days ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the quiet power of a woman who had found her voice and was no longer afraid to use it. The moment I decided to send the letter, I knew there was no turning back. It was not a gesture born from spite or anger, but from a place of quiet, unyielding clarity, a declaration that the woman I once was, the one who had endured years of dismissal and humiliation, had finally reclaimed her voice and her power. The letter was brief, carefully composed with steady hands, each word chosen not to wound but to draw a clear boundary that could not be crossed again. To my son and daughter-in-law, to the family that had so easily forgotten the woman who had raised them, I wrote that I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment, and under no duress. I informed them that any further attempts to control me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment, and that I had retained legal counsel. It was a cold, measured statement, the kind that leaves no room for negotiation or manipulation. As I folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sorrow, and an unexpected surge of strength. I was severing ties, yes, but not out of bitterness. It was a final, necessary act of self-preservation. I was telling them, and more importantly myself, that I was done being their shadow, their afterthought, their object of pity or annoyance. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the quiet punctuated only by the hum of the city outside and the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. I held a cup of tea, its warmth a comfort against the chill of isolation, and allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had done. This was not just a letter. It was a turning point, the moment I took back the narrative of my life. Alongside the letter, I took another symbolic step, one that seemed small but carried immense significance. I bought a bottle of hot sauce, the kind with a sharp, fiery kick, and carried it with me to the family home one evening under the cover of twilight. It was not an act of vengeance in the way one might imagine. I was not seeking to punish or humiliate them as they had done to me. Rather, it was a statement, a quiet but unmistakable reminder that I was no longer the passive victim in their story. When I found their shared bathroom, The sight of so many unspoken tensions and hidden resentments, I slipped the hot sauce into their communal toothpaste tube, a small controlled act of rebellion. The taste of fire that would greet them the next morning was a metaphor for the boundaries I had drawn, the flames that now marked the limits of their control. I left without looking back, knowing that the consequences would ripple through their carefully curated lives. In the days that followed, the family's reaction was a mix of confusion, frustration, and anger. The story of the toothpaste sabotage spread quickly, whispered behind closed doors, and exchanged in tense phone calls. Yet, I remained silent, choosing not to confirm or deny the act, letting the uncertainty unsettle them more than any direct confrontation could. Meanwhile, I focused on the life I was building for myself. The morning shifts at the cafe where I was gaining the respect of colleagues, the quiet walks through the neighborhood, and the small joys of independence that no one could take away. The visits from my grandson became a source of comfort and hope, a connection unmarred by the conflicts of the past. One afternoon, as I sat with him over tea, I felt the weight of years lift slightly, the promise of something new and unburdened glimmering on the horizon. The legal threats and attempts to control me continued for a time, but my letter had made it clear that I was no longer available for negotiation. I had hired an attorney, someone who understood the nuances of elder rights and the importance of autonomy. It was another layer of protection, a way to ensure that my choices would be respected. Through all this, I learned the power of saying no, firmly, unapologetically, and the strength that comes from holding on to one's dignity even when the world seems determined to strip it away. The climax of my journey was not a dramatic confrontation or a shouting match. It was a series of quiet, deliberate decisions that reclaimed my life and my self-worth. It was the moment I chose myself over the expectations and demands of others. I realized that the power I sought was not in control over others, but in control over my own story, my own body, and my own heart. The act of placing that bottle of hot sauce in their toothpaste was symbolic. Yes, but it was also deeply personal. It was a declaration that I would no longer swallow their cruelty or their dismissals, that I could respond with a sharpness of my own, a fire that could not be ignored. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a change in myself as well as in them. I walked taller, spoke clearer, and felt the boundaries I had set reinforcing themselves like invisible armor. The family's attempts to manipulate or guilt me lost their power. I was no longer the woman who crumbled beneath their words. Instead, I was someone who had found the courage to stand firm, to say no, and to live fully on her own terms. And so, the climax was both an ending and a beginning, the closing of a painful chapter and the opening of a new one defined by strength, clarity, and peace. It was proof that even after decades of being overlooked and undervalued, a woman could rise, not with shouts or storms, but with steady, purposeful fire. I was no longer a passive figure in their lives. I was the author of my own fate, and this was my final, irrevocable signature. The days that followed the storm of confrontation settled into a new kind of quiet, one not born of avoidance or resignation, but of peace and clarity. I woke each morning with a sense of calm that had long eluded me, a feeling that I was finally living in the space I had carved out for myself, no longer shrinking beneath the weight of expectations or past wounds. The apartment, once just a shelter from loneliness, became a sanctuary where every corner held a piece of the woman I was rediscovering. I tended to my garden with gentle care, watching the bright nasturtiums bloom against the windowpane, fiery, resilient flowers that seemed to echo the fire I had lit within my own heart. The routine of work at the cafe gave me purpose and connection, a place where I was valued not for my past, but for the person I showed up as each day. The friendships I nurtured there were simple but profound, built on mutual respect, and shared moments rather than obligation or family history. My grandson's visits remained a source of quiet joy, A reminder that love can endure even when the tides of family loyalty shift and change. Our conversations were gentle and unhurried, filled with small talk and shared silences that spoke volumes more than words ever could. He did not press me for explanations or apologies, and I did not offer them. Instead, we simply existed together in the space we had created, a space of understanding and acceptance that transcended the past. The phone stayed off most days, tucked away like a fragile artifact of a life I had left behind. When I did turn it on, I was met with messages and calls, some from my family, some from others. But I no longer felt the compulsion to respond immediately or at all. I was learning to live on my own terms, with boundaries that protected my peace and nurtured my dignity. Letters came and went, some carefully composed and sent, others written and kept hidden in the drawer like secret prayers or confessions. One evening, I found myself writing a letter not to my family but to myself. A letter filled with words of kindness and affirmation that I needed to hear. I wrote of the strength it had taken to walk away, of the courage to say no, and of the quiet victories that marked each day. I sealed the letter and tucked it into the back of my journal, a talisman against forgetfulness and despair. The years of waiting, hoping, and hiding had given way to a life that was not perfect, but was entirely mine. I was no longer the woman who waited for permission to exist, who shrank beneath the judgment of others or the pain of exclusion. I was a woman who stood tall, whose voice was steady, and whose spirit was unbroken. The house of my past, the family that had once been my world, became a distant memory. Not a wound reopened, but a story I carried with grace and acceptance. The final letter I sent to the lawyer was a quiet declaration of independence, a legal seal on the freedom I had claimed with my own hands and heart. It was the last formal boundary I set, a clear message that my life was mine to live as I chose, without interference or manipulation. In the stillness of these days, I found a new kind of joy, one not dependent on others' approval or presence, but born from the deep well of self-respect and peace. I learned that healing is not a straight path but a spiral, a journey that circles back to itself with new insight and strength. And in this journey, I discovered that I was never truly alone. There were others, women like me, who had been dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued, who found their own ways to rise and reclaim their stories. To them, I offer this message. Do not wait for a perfect moment or for someone else to give you permission. Your voice matters, your story matters, and your life matters. You have the power to choose yourself, to step out of the shadows and into the light of your own making. And when you do, you will find that the world, or at least your world, shifts in ways you never imagined. The coat I bought for myself, the one that fit like a second skin, hangs by the door as a daily reminder of the woman I am, strong, capable, and unapologetically whole. The laughter that once belonged to others now bubbles quietly within me, a celebration not of past pains, but of present freedom. As I sit by the window, watching the seasons change and the wind stir the leaves, I feel the steady pulse of life beneath my fingertips and in the beat of my heart. I have walked away from a past that no longer serves me, and in doing so, I have walked into a future of my own making. This is not the end, but a beginning, a new chapter written with courage, dignity, and hope. And if this story finds you at a moment when you feel lost or invisible, know this: you are seen, you are heard, and you are never alone. The step away is the first step toward the life you deserve. When you take it, come back and tell me. I will be here, ready to listen, ready to welcome you home. It had been 3 months since the letter. 3 months since the bottle of hot sauce had found its way into their toothpaste. And in that time, my life had taken on a rhythm I could never have imagined during the long years I spent tethered to their approval. The days passed without drama, without those sharp shocks of humiliation or tension that once seemed unavoidable. and instead I woke each morning to something rare and unfamiliar. The absence of fear. I no longer flinched at the sound of my phone ringing, no longer braced myself for the sudden intrusion of voices that sought to dictate the terms of my existence. My mornings began with quiet rituals: boiling water for tea, opening the curtains to let the sunlight flood the small room, and stepping out onto the balcony to breathe in the scent of the city as it came alive. These were not grand gestures, but they were mine, and their simplicity held a kind of profound beauty I had long overlooked. In the beginning, I thought often of the family and of the rupture I had created, wondering if they spoke of me with anger or regret, or if they had already moved on to the next object of their control. But as the weeks passed, I found that their absence in my life left not an empty space, but a wide open expanse into which I could grow. I began filling that space with people who brought warmth instead of judgment. There was Linda, a widow who lived 2 streets away, who invited me to join her for morning walks in the park. We moved slowly, matching our pace to our conversations, speaking of books, recipes, and the strange turns our lives had taken. There was Raphael, a retired teacher who ran the small second-hand bookshop on the corner, who seemed to know exactly what I needed to read before I did. And there were the women at the library's knitting circle, who welcomed me into their fold without questions about the past. The change in my world was not only external but deeply internal. I no longer measured my worth against their approval, no longer questioned whether I was too much or not enough. I discovered I could take up space, in a room, in a conversation, in my own heart. Without apology, I began writing again. Not just in my journal, but in letters I would never send. Stories and reflections that belonged only to me. Some evenings, I would sit by the window, pen in hand, and let the words pour out without censoring them. I wrote of the birthday night, of the bitterness of that first sip of poisoned drink, of the burning humiliation that had driven me into the bathroom. But I also wrote of the hot sauce, of the quiet satisfaction of placing it where they would least expect it, of the way my hands did not shake as they once might have. In writing, I found a new kind of release, not of forgiveness, but of ownership over the story. It was during one of these writing sessions that I received a letter from my grandson. This time, it was different. There was no undercurrent of manipulation, no subtle pressure to return. He wrote simply to tell me that he had moved out of his parents' house, that he had found work at a small design firm in another city. He did not ask me to come back or to reopen old wounds. Instead, he told me about the park near his apartment, the little bakery he passed on his way to work, and the stray cat that had adopted him. At the bottom of the letter, he wrote, "You were right to leave. I see that now." I held the paper in my hands for a long time, letting the words sink in, feeling the quiet vindication of being seen, truly seen, by at least one person who mattered. The encounter with the past was not entirely over, of course. There were moments when I caught sight of my daughter-in-law in the grocery store, or passed my son's car parked on a street I had once known by heart. Each time I felt a jolt, not of fear, but of something like detachment, as if they belonged to a different lifetime. Once we made brief eye contact in the produce aisle. She looked away first. That small detail, almost imperceptible, carried more weight than I could explain. It was not a victory in the loud, triumphant sense, but in the quiet, enduring sense that I no longer occupied the role they had written for me. One evening in late spring, I decided to host a small gathering at my apartment, my first in years. The guests were not family by blood, but by choice. The friends I had made in this new chapter of my life. We shared food, laughter, and stories that had nothing to do with the past. At some point, someone mentioned birthdays, and I realized that my next one was just a few weeks away. The thought no longer carried the sting it once did. I would not spend it locked in a bathroom or enduring forced laughter. I would spend it exactly as I wished, with people who respected the life I had fought to build. That night, after everyone had gone and the apartment was quiet again, I made myself a cup of tea and stood at the window, looking out at the streetlights flickering against the dark. In the reflection of the glass, I saw not the woman they had tried to reduce, but the woman I had become. Older, yes, and marked by scars both visible and invisible, but also unafraid, unapologetic, and unbroken. If there is one truth I have learned in all of this, it is that we cannot control how others see us, but we can control how we see ourselves. They may still tell their version of the story, casting me as difficult, ungrateful, or lost. Let them. I know the truth, and the truth is that I walked away from the cage they built and found the wide open air of my own freedom. And perhaps one day, if my grandson asks me directly about the hot sauce, I will tell him. I will tell him how a single act, small in the eyes of the world, but enormous in the landscape of my life, marked the moment I chose myself. And I will tell him that every sip of tea I take now tastes sweeter for it.